In all my years on the bench, I've learned that you can usually tell what kind of case you're about to face by the way a person walks through the courtroom doors. Some people enter quietly, shoulders rounded, remorse already written across their face. Others shuffle in with nervous energy, clutching papers or fidgeting with their jacket. But on that Tuesday morning, one of those crisp New England mornings where the light hits the courthouse windows just right, the man who walked into my courtroom didn't fit either category. He didn't walk in. He arrived. I remember hearing the echo before I saw him, the sharp tap of Italian leather shoes, the sort of rhythm made only by someone who fully believes the world moves out of his way. When the door opened, the room filled with a hush, not out of respect, but surprise. Even the officers along the back wall straightened. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's yearly mortgage payments, a watch whose face glinted like it held its own private sun, and the confident half-smile of a man too familiar with getting his way. His name was Elliot Vance, CEO of Vance Tech International. A man whose face appeared regularly in business magazines and on television interviews. A man whose company employed nearly 2,000 Rhode Islanders. A man accustomed to boardrooms, private jets, and quarterly earnings calls, not municipal courtrooms. But there he was. He didn't wait for the clerk to call his case. He simply strolled to the defense table with a casualness that bordered on insolence. His lawyer, a polished man with silver cufflinks and an even more polished grin, trailed behind him like a well-trained shadow. "Your Honor," the lawyer began before I'd even settled back in my chair, "Mr. Vance is here as a courtesy. He's a very busy man, so if we could expedite." I held up a hand. "Counselor, we'll proceed in the order the cases are called." The lawyer's smile faltered just enough to reveal his irritation. Vance didn't even look at me. He had taken out his phone. Now, phones in my courtroom have always been a simple rule, off or away. Not complicated. I gently remind people daily, students, grandmothers, delivery workers, tenants, soldiers home on leave. And almost always, they comply with an embarrassed smile or a murmured apology. Vance didn't bother with either. He scrolled through his screen with a small smirk, completely uninterested in the people around him. He wasn't being defiant in a loud or aggressive way. No, this was worse. It was the quiet, practiced dismissal of someone who had made a career out of treating rules as little more than suggestions crafted for other people. When the clerk finally called his case, Vance didn't look up. His lawyer nudged him. Only then did he rise, slowly, deliberately, without once acknowledging the court. The charge was simple on paper but serious in reality, reckless driving resulting in property damage and endangerment. The police report indicated high speed. The victim was a local delivery driver, a hard-working man just trying to finish his route, whose vehicle had been struck and nearly overturned. Before I could speak, Vance chuckled. An actual laugh, as if the charge were an inconvenience, a clerical error, something beneath him. He finally looked at me and said, "Judge, let's just handle the fine and move on. I have a meeting in 30 minutes. The gallery stiffened. Even his lawyer looked momentarily panicked. And that was the moment, subtle but unmistakable, when I realized this was not going to be a normal case. Not a routine hearing. Not a simple judgment. No. This was going to be one of the most dangerous cases I had ever handled, because entitlement mixed with power can be far more volatile than any weapon. Before I ever heard the first piece of testimony, before a single photograph or report was placed before me, I already knew that cases like this rarely begin with the moment of impact, they begin long before, with habits, patterns, and the quiet confidence of someone who has spent years being told that consequences are for other people. Still, I owed it to everyone involved to examine the facts with care, and so I leaned back slightly, hands folded, watching Vance's bored expression as I began to outline what had brought him into my courtroom. The incident had occurred just after dawn on a Thursday, one of those misty mornings when the roads along South Water Street reflect the rising sun like a sheet of pale gold. According to the police report, the delivery driver, a man named Carlos Mendez, had been pulled over at the curb checking directions for the next stop on his route. Mendez had been working 2 jobs to support his wife and their newborn daughter. His delivery van was old but reliable, and he kept it spotless, even though the company hardly noticed such things. He had been sitting there for less than a minute when, without warning, a black Mercedes S-Class came roaring around the bend. The investigating officer estimated the car was traveling nearly 60 miles per hour in a 25 zone, weaving slightly, engine screaming as if the driver believed the city streets were his personal racetrack. Mendez, hearing the engine before he saw the car, told officers he had felt the air shift, a chilling detail that stayed with me. The Mercedes clipped the back corner of his van, jolting it violently onto the curb and nearly tipping it. Mendez struck his head against the doorframe but managed to stay conscious long enough to watch the Mercedes skid to a halt halfway up the block. A witness later said the driver had stepped out, looked at the damage as though evaluating a minor inconvenience, then returned to the car without so much as checking on Mendez. When officers arrived, they recognized the driver immediately, Elliot Vance, the man whose tech company's headquarters loomed over the waterfront like a glass and steel monument to ambition. The officers noted that he appeared impatient, disengaged, and dismissive, and that his first question, before they asked for his license or even assessed Mendez's condition, was, "Can we get this done quickly? I have a call in 10 minutes. One of the responding officers, a veteran named Sergeant Dana Fowler, had recorded her brief exchange with him. In her notes she wrote, "He kept pointing to his smartwatch as if I were wasting his time. I told him a man had been hurt. He said, he'll be fine. Let's wrap it up." What struck me, even before hearing any testimony, was how consistent the behavior was. Vance had not exploded in anger or panicked like someone who'd made a tragic mistake. Instead, he had reacted the way a man reacts when a valet loses his keys or when a restaurant seat isn't to his liking, annoyed, inconvenienced, faintly amused that anyone expected him to care. But what truly raised the stakes came from Mendez's employer, a small local company barely keeping afloat in an economy dominated by corporations like Vance Tech. The damaged van represented nearly a quarter of their monthly operating budget, and without it, 2 other drivers had been forced to double routes, risking late deliveries and lost clients. Mendez himself had suffered a concussion and had been unable to work for 2 weeks, unpaid. This wasn't a traffic incident. It was a fracture in the fragile balance between powerful and powerless. As I finished recounting the background in court, I watched Vance lean back in his chair, arms folded, exuding a kind of cold confidence that seemed to say he'd heard all this before and never once had it mattered. But for Mendez, for the struggling company, for the officers who wrote the reports, it mattered a great deal, and in my courtroom, that meant it mattered to me. And as I looked out at the gallery, I could feel something shift, the sense that we were heading toward a confrontation where truth, entitlement, and accountability were about to collide in a way none of us could fully predict. When we returned fully to the courtroom that morning, the atmosphere had taken on a kind of charged stillness, the sort that settles in just before 2 weather fronts collide, and I could feel the attention of every person in the gallery sharpening as if they sensed that what was about to unfold would reveal far more than a simple dispute over traffic violations. Vance sat at the defense table in a posture that communicated effortless superiority, his shoulders relaxed, one ankle resting over the opposite knee, and his gaze drifting around the room with the detached indifference of a man surveying property he believed he already owned. His lawyer positioned himself beside him, smoothing his tie in a way that suggested anticipation rather than concern, as though he expected the courtroom to bend easily to the influence of wealth and reputation. I began by asking Vance to confirm his identity, a routine question that thousands before him had answered without complication, yet the pause that followed was unmistakable. Instead of answering promptly, as any respectful defendant would, he offered a slow, almost theatrical sigh, glanced at his lawyer, and finally muttered, "You know who I am," as if stating his name aloud were somehow beneath his station. I kept my voice steady, neither rising to his provocation nor granting him the validation he seemed to expect. "Please answer the question for the record," I said, and after another small hesitation, he complied, though he delivered the words with the kind of reluctant authority one uses when speaking to someone they consider vastly beneath them. His lawyer immediately seized control of the moment. "Your Honor, we're prepared to make this extremely simple. My client acknowledges there was an unfortunate incident involving his vehicle. He is more than willing to cover the costs. If we could simply impose the standard fine and dismiss, I stopped him with a firm but measured interruption. Counselor, nothing is being dismissed until this court reviews the evidence and hears from all parties affected. The lawyer offered a tight smile, the sort people give when they intend to be diplomatic but cannot hide their irritation, and he responded, "Of course, Your Honor, though I must emphasize that Mr. Vance is a significant employer in this city. It serves no one to drag out something so minor." It was at that moment I noticed Carlos Mendez sitting quietly near the back, his hands folded in his lap, a thin bandage still visible along his hairline, his expression steady but weary. His presence reminded me that what the defense called minor had upended a man's livelihood, shaken his sense of safety, and placed him in the hospital, all while the defendant drove away in a luxury sedan as though brushing off a small inconvenience. I invited Mendez to approach, but before he could rise, Vance leaned forward and whispered, not quietly enough, "This is absurd." It was a tap, nothing more. These people exaggerate to squeeze money out of anyone with a name. The gallery reacted with a low murmur, and I felt a shift, not explosive, but unmistakable, as if every ordinary citizen in the room had suddenly recognized the familiar tone of someone who believed accountability was a burden meant only for others. I looked directly at Vance and said, "Mr. Vance, you will refrain from commentary until called upon. This courtroom is not your boardroom, and you are not negotiating a contract. You are responding to allegations that affected real people." He met my eyes for the first time that day, and for a brief second, the mask slipped. Behind the confidence was a flicker of annoyance, even disbelief, as though he were struggling to understand why his usual tactics of charm, money, and name recognition weren't having their customary effect. I then announced that we would be reviewing the dashcam footage and officer reports in open court. The lawyer attempted another protest, arguing that it was unnecessary, that the matter could be resolved quietly, without spectacle. But I knew better. Sometimes, sunlight is not a spectacle, it is simply the truth made visible. And as I called for the evidence to be presented, I could feel the tension in the room settle into place like the first click of a lock turning, signaling that the deeper battle, between power and responsibility, was only just beginning. When the lights dimmed slightly for the evidence presentation, a quiet settled over the courtroom, not the usual respectful silence, but a heavier, anticipatory one, the kind that gathers when everyone knows something important is about to surface, something that cannot be argued with or polished by lawyers or softened by public relations teams. As the clerk prepared the dashcam footage, I watched Vance lean back in his chair with the faint, dismissive smirk of a man who believed evidence was merely a formality, a procedural hoop he had long since learned to step through without consequence. The video began with the officer's car moving slowly along South Water Street, the early morning fog blurring the edges of parked cars and storefronts. The timestamp confirmed the hour, barely 6:30, and the city still looked half asleep. For a moment, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then, from the left edge of the frame, the black Mercedes burst into view like a flash of polished steel, streaking past the cruiser so quickly that the image blurred, the engine's roar distorted but unmistakable. I heard gasps across the gallery. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just the sound ordinary people make when they witness something far more reckless than they expected. The camera captured exactly what the police report described. The Mercedes veered slightly toward the right, its rear end fishtailing as the driver tried to correct at high speed, and then the split-second impact, a sharp jolt, a spray of debris, and Mendez's delivery van lurching violently onto the curb. The force of the hit sent the van's rear door swinging open, boxes tumbling onto the pavement like scattered chess pieces, and though the sound had been muted by distance, the image was enough. When the video paused, I shifted my attention to the defendant. For the first time since he had entered my courtroom, Vance's smirk had vanished, replaced by a taut expression that hovered somewhere between irritation and disbelief, irritation that anyone would dare hold this footage against him, disbelief that it looked so unequivocally bad. To ensure fairness, I allowed the defense an opportunity to respond, but before the lawyer could speak, Mendez approached slowly when I called him forward. He stood with a modest, almost apologetic posture, hands clasped, eyes lowered. He spoke quietly, but his voice carried the kind of sincerity that makes a room lean in rather than away. "Your Honor," he began, "I didn't think I was going to get hurt. I've done that route for years. I know the morning traffic, know where people usually speed, but that day, I didn't even have time to breathe before the whole van shook. I thought it was going to flip." His voice wavered briefly, not with theatrics, but with the honest memory of fear he hadn't yet fully processed. He explained how he had been saving money to repair the suspension on the van, how the company depended on every vehicle functioning, and how 2 missed weeks of work meant bills piling up. "I don't want trouble," he said. "I just want to feel safe doing my job." It was a simple statement, but in that simplicity lay the full human cost of what Vance had dismissed as a tap. When Mendez stepped back, Vance finally broke his silence. "With all due respect," he said, his voice firm and edged with disdain, "he's exaggerating. The video makes it look worse because of the angle. My car barely." His lawyer touched his arm, a subtle warning, but the damage was already done. The gallery exhaled collectively, as if the true nature of the defendant had finally stepped fully into the light without disguise. In that moment, something irreversible shifted. Not just in the evidence, but in the room. And I knew that what came next would determine whether this courtroom remained a place where truth carried weight, or whether power and ego would attempt to bulldoze it. There is a specific moment in some cases, a moment I have seen only a handful of times in my decades on the bench, when the facade that powerful people construct around themselves begins to fracture, not from physical force or shouted accusations, but under the quiet, relentless weight of undeniable truth. As Act 5 of this story unfolded, I watched that moment arrive for Elliot Vance with a clarity so sharp it felt almost like watching a pane of glass crack in slow motion, each line spidering outward from a single, unavoidable point. After the dashcam footage, after Mendez's quiet but indisputable testimony, I offered the defense the opportunity to present any mitigating information. This is standard procedure, but I could tell by the tightness in the lawyer's jaw that he knew there was no argument strong enough to erase what the courtroom had just witnessed. Still, he rose, straightened his cuffs, and attempted a familiar strategy, minimizing, reframing, and redirecting responsibility. "Your Honor," he began, adopting a tone meant to sound measured and reasonable, "what we have here is an unfortunate accident amplified by outdated equipment and a misunderstanding of vehicle dynamics. The footage exaggerates speed." I stopped him gently but firmly. "Counselor, the physics are clear, the impact is recorded, the injuries are documented, and your client did not render aid. Please proceed with relevant information." The lawyer opened his mouth, but before he could manage a coherent argument, Vance pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the courtroom floor with a harsh sound that pulled every eye toward him. He stood, shoulders squared, and for the first time he directed his full attention at me, his expression no longer indifferent but openly incredulous, even offended. "Let's stop pretending," he said, each word clipped and sharpened by barely contained frustration. "This entire situation is ridiculous. I pay more in taxes in a month than most of the people in this room make in a year, and you're treating me like some reckless teenager who stole a car." The reaction was instantaneous, a stiffening of backs in the gallery, a sharp intake of breath from Mendez, a subtle shift from the officers stationed near the wall, but I held up a hand, keeping my voice calm. "Mr. Vance, sit down." He didn't. Instead, he stepped closer to the bench, not enough to violate procedure but enough to communicate that he intended to dominate the space. "Do you have any idea how many jobs I provide? How many families depend on my company? If I wanted to, I could move my entire operation to Boston tomorrow and leave this city scrambling to replace what I contribute. And we're all sitting here wasting time because this delivery driver had a bad morning?" His lawyer whispered urgently for him to stop, tugging at his sleeve, but Vance shook him off with a flick of the wrist. "This court," he continued, voice rising, "should be thanking me, not lecturing me. I build things. I create value. I don't answer to people who don't understand how the world actually works." And then, in a moment so unguarded that it seemed to burst out of him, he delivered the sentence that silenced the room completely, the sentence that revealed everything simmering beneath his polished exterior. People like me don't follow the same rules as people like you. The words hung in the air, heavy, unmistakable, echoing against the old wooden walls until even he seemed to hear them differently, his expression flickering with a split-second awareness that he had said too much. I looked at him steadily, and in that instant, I understood that we had crossed a threshold. This was no longer about a collision, or a fine, or a damaged van. This was about the core belief that power exempts one from accountability, the most dangerous belief a person can carry into a courtroom. I folded my hands, leaned forward slightly, and said, very quietly, "Mr. Vance, please return to your seat." And for the first time that day, he obeyed. Because he could sense what I already knew, judgment was coming, and it would not bend to wealth, ego, or fear. There is a stillness that settles over a courtroom just before sentencing, a kind of collective breath-holding that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation, because in that moment, everyone in the room, from the defendant to the quietest spectator, understands that what comes next will reveal not just the fate of one person, but the principles that the court itself stands upon. As I looked at Elliot Vance seated before me, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the polished surface of the defense table, I felt that familiar weight settle in my chest, the weight that comes when justice demands clarity, courage, and an unwavering spine. I began with the facts, not because the room needed a reminder, but because truth must always anchor the judgment. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice measured, steady, carrying through the silence, "you operated your vehicle at more than twice the legal speed limit on a public street during morning work hours. You struck another man's vehicle with enough force to endanger his life and destroy his means of earning a living. You failed to render aid. And then, throughout these proceedings, you displayed contempt, both for this court and for the men and women who share your community." He shifted in his seat, but I continued, unwilling to let the significance of those actions soften under the shield of discomfort. "Recklessness is dangerous. But arrogance paired with recklessness is catastrophic. Not because of the damage already done, but because of the damage such a mindset guarantees in the future if left unchallenged." His lawyer interjected softly, "Your Honor, if we could consider alternatives," but I raised a hand, not harshly, but decisively, signaling that this moment was not one to be negotiated. "Mr. Vance," I continued, "you told this courtroom, in your own words, that people like you do not follow the same rules as everyone else. That statement, perhaps more than anything else presented here, reveals why consequences are not merely appropriate, they are necessary." His eyes met mine then, and for the first time since the hearing began, I saw something flicker behind the facade, not fear, exactly, but the dawning realization that wealth could not insulate him from accountability in this room. I laid out the sentence carefully, each component chosen not from anger, but from principle. "First," I said, "your license is suspended for 90 days. Not because it inconveniences you, but because you have demonstrated that you cannot be trusted to operate a vehicle responsibly." A ripple of reaction passed through the gallery, but I pressed on. "Second, you will pay full restitution to Mr. Mendez and his employer for the damage to the vehicle, the lost income, and any medical expenses related to the incident. These payments will come directly from you, not from your company, not from an insurance intermediary, not from a corporate fund." Vance inhaled sharply at that, a brief but unmistakable flash of resistance. "Third," I continued, "you will perform 100 hours of community service, and not in a corporate office or at a charity gala. You will work directly with the Providence Community Transportation Program, assisting with vehicle maintenance, route support, and public safety outreach." That finally broke through his composure. "Manual labor," he said under his breath, as though the phrase itself were an insult. "Yes," I replied. "Because humility grows fastest when we stand in the shoes of those we have harmed." And then, the final measure, the one he never expected. "Lastly, this court refers your conduct to the Department of Motor Vehicles and the City Transportation Oversight Board for review of your commercial transport privileges. Your behavior raises serious questions about your respect for public safety." The room was silent. Even the air seemed to pause. I concluded with the words I reserve for moments when justice demands a lesson deeper than punishment. Mr. Vance, let this be clear. Power does not excuse responsibility. Wealth does not erase harm. And titles do not place anyone above the law. In this courtroom, every person stands equal, whether they drive a delivery van or a Mercedes. And as the gavel came down, I saw it, the first crack of humility in a man who had never known it. There is a misconception, especially among those who watch court proceedings from the outside, that a judge's work ends the moment the gavel falls, that the sentence is the final act and the rest unfolds somewhere beyond our sight. But I've learned over the years that cases linger, they ripple outward into the lives of the people involved, into departments and workplaces and neighborhoods, into the quiet corners of public trust where the meaning of justice either strengthens or slowly erodes. And as the days and weeks passed after sentencing Elliot Vance, I found myself thinking often about the aftermath, about what accountability truly accomplishes when it reaches someone who has never tasted it before. The media picked up the story quickly, not because it involved scandal or celebrity gossip, but because, in a world increasingly skeptical of institutions, people still respond when they witness fairness applied without fear or favoritism. Articles framed the case in different ways, some focused on the reckless driving itself, others on the arrogance displayed in the courtroom, and still others on the broader question of whether wealth had finally met a boundary it could not purchase its way through. But the overwhelming tone, from what I gathered, was one of relief. Relief that justice, in this instance, had not blinked. Mendez returned to work slowly, easing back into his delivery routes while still recovering from the concussion's lingering fog. One morning, as I arrived at the courthouse before hearings began, he approached me outside, hesitant, respectful, holding a small coffee he insisted I accept as a thank you. He told me his company had stabilized after receiving restitution, that his van had been repaired, and that he felt, for the first time since the accident, like someone had truly listened to him. I told him what I tell many victims, that his dignity never depended on the severity of his injuries, but on his willingness to stand before the court and speak honestly. He nodded, and I could see that the weight he carried the day he testified had lifted, if only slightly. As for Vance, the transformation was slower, but it came in ways I had hoped for but never assumed. Reports from the community service coordinator described a man who showed up on time, at first stiff and irritated, then gradually quieter, more focused, less concerned with being recognized and more willing to listen. He spent hours assisting with route planning, shadowing the very drivers whose world he had once dismissed, repairing punctured tires, applying reflective tape to vans, and carrying crates of supplies. The work, small as it may seem to some, had a way of recalibrating a person's sense of place in the world. And then, one afternoon near the end of his service, I received a letter, not from his attorney, not from his company, but from Vance himself. It was handwritten, the pen strokes tight at first, then loosening as the paragraphs continued. He did not make excuses. He did not ask for reconsideration. Instead, he wrote that he had never, in all his years of running boardrooms and overseeing departments, understood the fragility of the work that keeps a city running. He wrote that watching the dashcam footage again during his reevaluation had shaken him more than he admitted. And he wrote, with a candidness I did not expect, "You were right to stop me. I needed to be stopped." I placed the letter in my desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that justice, at its best, does not humiliate, it restores. Looking back, the lesson crystallized with a clarity that has stayed with me ever since. In a society strained by inequality and eroding trust, the most powerful force a courtroom can wield is not punishment for punishment's sake, but the unwavering insistence that every life matters equally under the law, whether that life sits behind the wheel of a delivery van or behind the desk of a corporate empire. And so, as I often do at the close of a case that tested the limits of fairness, I leave you with the truth I carry into every decision, every sentence, every judgment. Power without humility becomes corruption. Privilege without accountability becomes danger. But justice, real, steady, unflinching justice, is the great equalizer. I'm Judge Caprio. And in my courtroom, your title will never matter more than your actions.